computer. Free speech, PC, and of course, postmodernism. Hi, and welcome to my channel, The World of Rועי Yozevich, when I host interesting and fascinating people from all around the world. And today, I'm privileged and honored to have Professor Stephen Hicks on the show. Now, Professor Hicks is one of the most famous scholars to explain and attack postmodernism philosophy. Let me quote John Anderson, with whom you had a great conversation 2 months ago. Stephen Hicks is a philosopher who is well known for his expertise in demystifying postmodernist ideology. His insight into postmodernism and politically correctness have extra significance today as we see university progressive activism spilling out into the streets. So I couldn't phrase it better than John Anderson. Beside what I just told you, he teaches at Rockford University, where he also directs the Center of Ethics and Entrepreneurship. He is the author of books like Explaining Postmodernism and Unveil Postmodernism in the Hebrew version, and Nietzsche and the Nazis, and another book, which is, I don't know. There is one more, yes?
Well, yeah, there's a few other ones, but yeah, those are the two ones most relevant to our topic today. Thanks for the gracious introduction.
Okay, so this is the Israeli-style introduction. Now, today we said that we are going to restrict our conversation to free speech in academia and science, okay? And before we started the recording, I told you that I come from the computer science, and I deals with artificial intelligence for robotics. And this is a very interesting topic. Should we enforce free speech on robotics, on robots as well? But let me just start with the first question. Now, from my experience, you need, in those kinds of conversations, you need to get the definitions straight. So let's start with free speech. We know that American students are against hate speech. And we know as a joke that hate speech is any opinion that I don't agree with. Now, beyond this joke, would you say that hate speech actually exists? And if so, what is it?
Okay. Well, yes, there is such a thing as hate speech, and my view is there should be no restrictions at all on speech as a general principle, and that would include hate speech. Hate is an emotion. It's a human emotion. It's a strong revulsion against something that you perceive to be a major threat to your values, and that can be a perfectly legitimate emotion for people to experience. Of course, like any other emotion, people can have incorrect beliefs or false beliefs or immoral beliefs that lead them to feel hate inappropriately. So the first question is, is the expression of hate a legitimate thing or not? And that's going to in part turn on, do you think the underlying beliefs that give rise to the hate are legitimate or not? So what I would say is human beings should be free to think whatever they judge is important. They should be able to express in cognitive form, verbally, by means of text, what their ideas are. And a lot of our communication is through emotional signaling, and we should be allowed freely to express whatever we are feeling. So I think that is most importantly because as human beings, we are an intelligent species potentially, and that is the fundamental for our understanding the way the world works. So we formulate our beliefs and we know how to act in the world, including how we interact with other human beings. If you stifle human thinking, then you are stifling the human ability to survive and flourish, including survival, social, and flourishing. Now, all of that said, of course, there are contexts within which we say, well, should I express this thought now or should I keep it to myself? How should I express this thought? And in many cases, context will specify principles of civility and ranges of limits of what you can express or so. But all of those need to be very tightly defined. And I also want to say that all of those restrictions should be arising through conversation and tailored to the context, and that all of the participants will agree to those conversational restrictions. So for example, I'm a philosophy professor, so I'm meeting several times every week with undergraduate students. And the only way philosophy can work is if we take on these huge issues about which there's great disagreement and they really push people's value buttons very fundamentally. And you've got young people who need to explore all of these ideas and try ideas out and debate with each other and learn how to debate on that. So if I go into a class like that and I make it very clear up front that, hey, I'm the professor and there are certain ideas that you cannot express, or you can never get angry and you can never respond in a certain way, that is going to short circuit the process. So I can't in any authoritarian way put limitations on the process. What I can say as a liberal in the classical sense professor is, this is what we're doing in philosophy. You are human beings. You need to work all of these things out, but we are going to do that socially. And the way that's going to work is if we all recognize that if we are threatening each other physically, verbally beyond certain ways, attacking people in certain ways, this isn't really going to work. And to the extent students then grasp that that's appropriately, they will voluntarily agree to restrict themselves. Now, of course, they're young people, they're going to make mistakes, but they should be self-monitoring and self-regulating. So I'm against any sort of hate speech restrictions.
But when you say we need to do it socially, the one thing that came to mind is like a safe space. And we don't want safe space. In one of your conversations that I saw on the internet, you said, let's assume that there is a person on academia said that I'm so sensitive that I can't even hear certain kinds of opinions. So we need to send him to see a psychologist. So what is the borderline between, okay, I got what you say, between being able to say or express your opinion and being rude? You don't need to be rude, you need to be polite. But where lies the line between something that I cannot say?
No, exactly right. And there is no way ahead of time to draw where that line is, because every individual is different, every relationship is different. And so it's a matter of ongoing judgment call about what's appropriate. So, and then as you mentioned, there are cultural differences as well, and we need to recognize that there are cultural differences and take those into account. It's a bit like anything in life. We can say, okay, I'm going to have a relationship with some woman I'm attracted to. Where do I draw the line between saying, yes, I'm attracted enough to ask her out on a date, or I've been dating her? Where do I draw the line and say, I'm going to not date her anymore, I'm going to break up with her? There is no mechanical ahead of time line that you can draw on these things. It's got to emerge by the individuals involved in judgment form. So yes, we all recognize what counts as being rude, but that again shifts from context to context. It's one thing if I'm sending a text and I just say, see you in 5 minutes, gone, right? And that's the entire talk of a minute. But you and I are conversing right here. If all I were to say is, see you in 5 minutes and then just turn my back on you, that would be inappropriate. That would be a little bit rude. And also tone of voice matters, right? And so forth. It also, it would matter if I'm showing up for a job interview and the person says to me, okay, I'm ready to interview now, but I'm, doing something on my phone, and I just say, see you in 5 minutes. Right? Well, that would be rude in that particular context. So there's no way to take even a simple formulation of words, see you in 5 minutes, and specify all of the contexts and situations within which you can say that or not say that, and in what tone of voice and to whom. It's not possible. That's why on most things in life, individual judgment matters.
In other words, you can distinguish how from what. And this is a very big problem, because if I would say there are genetic IQ differences between white and blacks in the US, it's very hard to phrase it in, no matter how much you try, in a sensitive way. So it's very, very, very hard. Now, let me Yes.
No, absolutely. And again, that's part of the sensitivity, right? Training issue that you have to go on, right? I mean, what do you say to people who are at a funeral, right? Well, you have to be enormously sensitive to that person's emotional context, right? Or someone who's just gone through a divorce or has lost a child or has lost a job or something like that. So part of being a decent person in a social context is knowing your own situation and what you want to express, but also being sensitive to the other people's context as well. So yeah, issues of racism, we know those are button pushing. And so we have to be, I think, yeah, extraordinarily sensitive there. But at the same time, we should not say there are issues that we can't talk about, even things that we think are false, offensive, that have a hidden political agenda, that we're dealing with someone who's psychologically disturbed. We can't ahead of time say, no, you just can't express those views. Now, partly because of the general principles that we've just talked about, but also, if you just censor something, it doesn't really change the dynamic. Instead, all it does is it drives it underground and it makes the problem worse. So if there's a view that you think is false about racial differences and so on, let people express that. If it really is false, then we should have the data and the argumentation to be able to show that it's false, and then we're in a stronger position.
I must tell you a story. Garrett Jones told me this story. Professor Garrett Jones is professor of economics and intelligence. And he told me that the number one environmentalist in the terms of IQ differences is James Flynn, the scholar from New Zealand. And James Flynn tried very, very heavily to get funds in the US to prove that all IQ differences are purely environmental. And he couldn't get the money. Part of the reason, according to Flynn, because scholars in the US afraid that this is not the case, and if they give him money to prove otherwise, it will be on their name that there are some inherently genetic IQ differences. So it's very it's very dangerous. It's very delicate. Now, let me give you two examples, okay? One is a flat earth theory, and the other is Holocaust deniers. Now, what should we do in science? Because we said I want to talk about free speech in science, academia, and society. What should we do with Holocaust denier on Facebook and on and flat earth theory? Should we embrace those theories and say, let the better theory win, or should we say no? There are some kinds of limits of free speech.
Yeah, well, I would say again the general principle: no limits, right, whatsoever. Right, people are going to hear these ideas out there, and if you are interested in the truth, the question's always going to be what puts people in the position to know the truth, and you don't know the truth just because you read something in a book or your parents or your teachers told you and you just believe them on the basis of authority. So something might be true, but for you to know that it's a truth, you have to know the evidence and the arguments and the counter arguments right for it. So I don't want to have a whole generation of students going around just parroting the earth is a sphere, right? Because that's what they happen to have heard from people when they were young. And in fact, this is an issue that I raise sometimes in my class as a simple example. We have all heard that the earth is a sphere, but how do you know that the earth actually is a sphere? And in many cases, they've never really thought about it.
It's very hard to prove.
That's right. Well, actually, maybe not. You can, so we start talking about examples, what happens when the sun is setting over the horizon? Is it just the fact that the sun gets smaller and smaller until you can't see it anymore? Or is it the case that you are seeing the whole sun, then you're seeing the top 3/4 of it, then half and so forth, which indicates curvature, or if you're doing it at the sea? Or what do you see if you study eclipses? And what do you think about satellite photos and lunar shots, right, and so forth? So that's then to point them in the direction of saying there is observational evidence that's available to them. And if they're interested, they can go out and look at the observational evidence and then verify it for themselves. So you're training the rational, and in this case, the more systematic they become, the scientific method in them. And at the same time, you know, to the extent that flat Earth is a belief that's out there, well, what are the arguments the flat earthers make? Let's look at them. And part of the training of a rational mind is being able to distinguish pseudoscientific claims from special pleading kinds of claims, and getting students to recognize when people are taking evidence and just reinterpreting it or ignoring the evidence or engaging in ad hominem attacks or various kinds of conspiracy theories. So all of those are useful things to train students to be able to do. So I would say, you know, flat Earth is a beautiful working example that every student should be exposed to. Now, then we scale up to something like Holocaust, right? Denial.
Holocaust deniers, yes.
Right, and then we know that, you know, because of the history of it, you know, it's right up there with racism and sexism and how we think about slavery and you know, child mutilation of girls, right, and so forth. You know, and the abortion issue. And so, but I would say, right, once again, part of intellectual training for young people is you need to have the intellectual toughness, the intellectual skills, the emotional skills, and the emotional toughness to be able to deal with the most difficult human issues that human beings face. So we're not going to shy away from arguments about racism, sexism, approaches to poverty, dictatorialism, the Holocaust, slavery, and so on. We're going to take them on. If there are people who want to minimize the scale of the Holocaust or excuse the perpetrators, well, what are those arguments? We need to know what they are so we can counter them.
In other words, what you're saying is basically the John Stuart Mill approach, that any truth that needs authority to remain truth is much less convincing than that other truth. By the way, in 2016, there was a conference at Harvard University titled, Is the PC movement help Trump to get elected? And Steven Pinker, one of the speakers there, said, of course, yes, because this is exactly what you just told me. If you are not allowed in certain kinds of truths in academia, like crime rates are massively different among races and intelligence, etc., and if you are not exposed to those kinds of truth, you only get them from the alt-right, so you will flip. And as our profession in academia is to train the student with argument and counter-argument. But now we don't do it because of we don't have free speech. So in my profession, in my discipline, in the sciences, everything is fine because we seek truth. But in the humanities, in your discipline, this is a major problem. No?
Yes, it's a major problem. No, absolutely. So if you take, the most obnoxious political views that you think are out there from your perspective, as a matter of your own self-interest and your own self-preservation, you want those views to be out there publicly so that you know what they are, who's articulating them, and then you're in a position to combat them. What you don't want is for those obnoxious political views to be driven underground, where you don't know who's actually articulating, how organized they are, how angry they are, what they're planning, in which case, if it's the kind of view that's attractive at some atavistic level to people, at some point it's going to burst out in some virulent, very ugly, and perhaps physicalistic form, and you're not going to be prepared to deal with it.
Okay, now, which leads me to the next subject, which basically is the same. There is a strong relation between politically correctness and free speech, because PC, by its definition, restricts free speech. Now, there are two main definitions of politically correct, or PC. One is like the Jordan Peterson approach, with certain truth shouldn't be voiced because they might insult someone. I'm not saying that Jordan Peterson hold this approach, but this is a very common interpretation of PC. Would you agree?
The view is that we will restrict speech with respect to certain views.
Because we might insult someone.
That's right. So it's not so much the speaker that is the issue, it's this person to whom you're speaking, and their needs, sensitivity, context kind of trumps everything in that particular case. Yeah, that's one application, sure. Now, I would say that's a detail.
But first, Stephen, I would like to say, or I would like to give a different interpretation, which is a Herbert Marcuse interpretation. So it's over there. Marcuse had to defy the opposition. He found it in what he termed repressive tolerance, later known as politically correctness. In 1965, Marcuse wrote an essay that the name in which he argued that tolerance was good only if non-dominating ideas were allowed to flourish. And that non-dominating ideas could flourish only if dominating ideas were shut down. So this is another very different interpretation of politically correctness. What do you say?
Well, it's complementary to the one that you cited from Jordan Peterson, because the argument is that from Marcuse, you have dominating ideas and dominated ideas, or strong ideas and weaker ideas, right, socially speaking. So what he is saying is what we need is to have a kind of egalitarian expression of ideas. So we talk about redistributing wealth, Marcuse
of ideas.
Redistributing speech, right, and the effectiveness of ideas in a more egalitarian phase. Now, this comes where the Marcusean double standard fits with what Jordan Peterson is saying. If it's the dominating, or a person who's representing the dominating ideas who is speaking, that person will be restricted because the recipient of those ideas is in a weaker position or representing dominated ideas. And so we're restricting these persons' idea, we're disempowering them in order to elevate the power of these ones over here. So those are a complementary set of principles. Now, Marcuse, though, is speaking a little bit more broadly, because you also have the enforcers of the ideas. And in many cases, they are part of the power play themselves. And so ideas that they think they are in a position to shut down, even if they are the dominating ideas or another subsector of dominating ideas out there, as a matter of protecting their own power or augmenting their own power, they will use this repressive tolerance notion to shut down competing powerful ideas. But it's not about the recipient of those ideas. In that case, it's about their own power relationships.
So in your book, when you try to explain postmodernism, you start with Kant and then you go to Nietzsche, but and those are the dominant figures from and then Foucault, etc. But when Breitbart in his book Righteous Indignation, he puts a lot of emphasis on the role that Marcuse had in enforcing this hate speech or politically correctness movement in the US. So would you consider Marcuse to be a dominant force, or even the most dominant factor in the PC movement that we now have in the US?
Well, it depends what generation you're talking about. I mean, Kant is late 1700s, Nietzsche is late 1800s, Marcuse is 1960s on into the 1970s and so forth. So yes, at the formulation or the big transition in left-wing circles from the old left to the new left, right? Herbert Marcuse in the 1960s, when the new left is springing into existence, is a huge and towering figure. And he's quite prescient about dictating some of the strategies, that repressive tolerance argument, about the long march through the institutions. That is to say that rather than, from the outside waiting for the Marxist revolution to come, we need to work from inside the system. But then inside the system, the most important institutions are going to be the cultural institutions rather than certain other, say, business institutions or even political institutions. So he's important for the 1960s. But I would say, Marcuse is really a disciple of two earlier thinkers. When he was young, he was a gung-ho Marxist in the fairly classical tradition. And so Marxist thinking is deep, very deep in his psyche. And the other important thinker is Heidegger, who is an early 20th century thinker. Now, Heidegger is a national socialist, right, or a Nazi, and Karl Marx, of course, is a left-wing or an international socialist. So at some level, they are opposed to each other, very different metaphysics, in some cases different ontologies. But what Marcuse is doing is drawing on these two heavyweight traditions, Marxism and Heideggerianism, and then translating it for the context of the 1960s. So, yeah, Nietzsche is important as well, partly because if you want to know where Heidegger is coming from, Heidegger, in let's say 2/3 of the important stuff in Heidegger is a reworking of Nietzschean themes. So, you go. To put it in big picture terms, you've got Kant at the end of the 1800s, or sorry, the end of the 1700s, Marx in the middle of the 1800s, Nietzsche at the end of the 1800s, Heidegger in the early part of the 20th century, Marcuse in the middle part of the 20th century.
And now, who is like the most dominant figure right now in the PC movement in the US or in Europe?
Well, I would say a lot of the, I guess this is level of tactics, or sorry, the level of strategy and the level of abstraction that you are operating on. So I would say, when you are looking at the activists, it's like the theory that they are drawing upon is going to be some combination, and this would be the nasty physicalist, break windows and threaten people types of activists.
Sololinsky guys.
Sorry?
The Sololinsky guys.
Yes, that's right. And so he's coming up with a tactics manual, right?
Yes.
But I would say that the activists of this generation, the theory they're operating on is mostly Foucault. The strategy that they are operating on is going to be Marcuse, and then the tactics manual is something like Alinsky.
And who are the philosophers?
Who are the philosophers?
The philosophers now, the modern, the current era philosopher of PC.
Yeah, I don't know. Partly because I don't think right now PC is a very philosophical movement. I mean, when you look at the activists, even if you look at the people who have a PhD after their name and they're publishing in postmodern journals, they very superficially throw around the names of Nietzsche and Heidegger and Foucault and so forth, but they don't have a very deep engagement with it. And I think that's because we're now into second or third generation. Once you get to postmodern theory with its very strong skepticism, subjectivism, relativism, and so forth, what that tells you is it's really not worth your while to try to develop your cognitive faculties to figure out what the truth is and do science and argument and counter argument. Your theory is telling you all of that is relatively pointless. So what you're going to do then is breed a whole generation of intellectuals who are not actually deeply committed to the intellectual life. What they are committed to is they have a certain set of beliefs and they want to see those put in practice. So you see less theory and more activist training going on in themselves.
And this is why this movement of PC and postmodernism is more restricted to the humanities, because in the sciences we do have intellectual effort and we do have truth and we do have absolute truth that we strive for.
Yes, well, the postmoderns are coming for you scientists, so be on your guard. Healthy science does presuppose a kind of philosophy, kind of a naturalistic, pro-reason philosophy, and that does have to have a liberal ethos of you can think whatever you want and argue whatever you want. So if that naturalism and pro-rationality and pro-liberal philosophy is undercut, it's only going to be a matter of time before science is assaulted. And so at the margins of science, you probably already are aware of that going on. But you're right that it is the humanities that most of the corruption has existed in. Now, not uniformly in the humanities. There are some subsectors of the humanities and social sciences that are much worse, some that are relatively healthy. So we do need to do some kind of intellectual sociology and demographics rather than the sweeping claims. But it has precisely been in the humanities where, when we're looking at human beings with all of their emotions and ideas and histories and literature and art and so on, those are the most complicated things to try to figure out. It's most easy for skeptical arguments to have purchase, and so that's where they have had the most destructive power.
Okay, which leads me to the next question, because in the last, I think, 30 years, we've seen a massive improvement in neuroscience. And when I say massive improvement in neuroscience, I say that many questions that so far have been solely to the philosophy or psychology departments are now in the neuroscience department. We got those questions into the laboratory. For example, cognitive differences between men and women. Okay. Now, when I wrote my intelligent book, so it struck on me there are some topics that you cannot do research about. Okay. In 2005, the NSF in the United States, after what Lawrence Summers says about women having less aptitude for sciences, the president of Harvard University, the NSF said that we are not going to fund any research that claim to show cognitive differences between men and women. Now, Richard Heyer, which is the editor of the journal Intelligence, said, listen, Alzheimer progressed differently with men and women from the back to the front of your brain. So if I'm not allowed to research this, I won't be able to get into medicines that might suit better for men or women. So this is not about psychology. We are not doing clinical research, which is extremely important.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's going to be one example of bad philosophy initially. In this case, a certain sort of tabula rasa understanding of human nature, that we're just blank slates, chunks of plasticine or whatever, and that the differences between males and females are merely social and arbitrary. So all of that bad philosophy then becomes politicized, and then the politicization, right, affects scientific research, and then the scientific research is going to undercut medical differences, and then you end up people dying. And so when people start making the claims that in my discipline, philosophy is just irrelevant to practical life, it's all this abstract head in the cloud stuff, I think that's a very good example of the long road. And it is a long road from high philosophical abstraction, but getting those positions right, it literally is a life or death difference down the road. So if we end up with higher rates of women suffering inappropriately from Alzheimer's because we philosophically decided 2 generations ago that we're not allowed to ask certain questions and therefore not to do certain research, the suffering of those women is going to be on the hands of those bad philosophers.
Now, there is a very famous Edmund Burke quote, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of the evil is for good men to do nothing." Now, and my question is, why do we agree with that? After all, we are not Iran. They can't kill us. So why so many professors and doctors and scholars in academia put up with it? Why don't we stand and say, listen, we can't stand this anymore? We had this Ted Hill research paper about sex differences. This was a purely mathematical paper, and it was banished from the journal. Why can't the Stanford University and other universities say we are against this movement?
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the distressing things to me as a professor inside of academia. And I remember when I made the transition from being a student and a graduate student to becoming a professor and teaching at a few different universities, I was quite quickly disillusioned, not necessarily about the intelligence of my colleagues, but certainly about the character of many of them. So that I then from the inside started to see how many of them were actually committed to some sort of liberal education and teaching their students, and how many of them were interested in just indoctrinating students in their views, which I think is a total betrayal of your moral responsibility as a professor. But what you're getting to is the other one that was disillusioning to me was how many, well, I guess to put it bluntly, how many cowards there are, right, within the professoriate. Even among tenured professors. You think the whole idea of tenure as an institution is to protect people from the administration, protect them from bad politics so that they can fearlessly go out and seek the truth as they see fit. And so many of them want to fly under the radar, don't want to ruffle feathers. You know, their colleagues down the hall might say something mean to them in a faculty meeting. You know, that the dean or the provost might not give them their $2,000 raise this year. And just on the basis of those very small things, they are willing to be silent, and in many cases give tacit support to suppressions of ideas that really should be out there. So I don't know what the explanation for that is. I've got some psychological hypotheses, but I would just put these out as hypotheses. One just is that there's a social psychology of conformity that it seems to be pretty well documented, that people do want to go along with what seem to be the prevailing groups in their social views. And it's very hard for people to train themselves to have the virtues of intellectual independence and to be able publicly to stand up for what they believe. I think a certain amount of it is, and I understand when people are junior professors, they don't have tenure. They're often more reticent to express their views. But I do think also that even senior professors, they do have financial motivations, and and in the academic world, there's all kinds of very weird attitudes towards money. I think one of the issues is that most people who are professors haven't so-called worked a day in their lives. You know, they've not necessarily had a real job. They haven't started a business. They've never been, part of a corporation. So they don't understand money. They don't know where it comes from, and they're on a salary, and it's it's kind of a nice middle income salary, right, and so forth. But they have weird attitudes toward money, and so if they don't think they're going to get that $5,000 raise this coming year, that scares them, right? And then they want to suck up to whoever they think to be the powers that be, the senior person in their department, the department chair, the provost, or the dean who's going to make the decisions. And I know a certain amount of that also goes on. But I do want to say, I think probably the most important reason is going to be from my field, and that is that whoever captures the moral high ground in any debate, that people will, even if they have some qualms about what the issues are, if they think a certain position is the moral high ground, they will bend over backwards and give lots and lots of benefits of the doubt to anybody who is articulating that position. So if you take an issue like race, in a way that's very easy. It's not difficult to be not a racist, right? But not being a racist is part of the moral high ground. Now, in my view, that's it's an important but low-grade moral achievement not to be a racist. But in our culture and in our society, it has been, for all sorts of reasons, elevated to being a top issue. And so it has captured the moral high ground. And there's a certain set of issues and positions, rather, on racism that have captured the moral high ground. And people who might have some doubts about that are nonetheless not going to voice strong opinion or opposition to it, just because then that sounds to them, even to themselves, that they're attacking the position that has the moral high ground, and they just don't want to.
Ben Shapiro, Stephen, can you hear me?
I think we.
Okay, there is a book by Ben Shapiro called Bullies, and this book basically says that when the left argues with you, it doesn't attack your ideas, it attacks your personality. And this is something of the PC movement. Now, I would like your opinion about what is the connection between the PC and the new left or the liberal left in the US right now. Do you consider the left, or should I put it differently? Can I be a leaning left person without the PC?
Right. Well, yes, these tactics that I haven't read Ben Shapiro's book, but the tactic of ad hominem, right? Always attacking the person's argument, right, rather than their positions. That's an old tactic, and it doesn't have to come from the left. Pretty much every part of the political spectrum, with the exception of people who are robust liberals, will use this tactic. So, history is filled with people. Right,
just a second. So, yes, please.
Okay. So yes, ad hominem, or attacking the person rather than the argument, that's an old tactic. And except for people who are strongly liberal, you will find people all over the political spectrum, right, using that argument. So, in arguments about traditional religion, and people then who will package traditional religion, say, with a far right or strongly conservative position, their argument will be, if you're arguing against their religion or an argument against the existence of God, well, they will just, say that shows that you are in rebellion with God. You're a bad person. So that's an old, well-worn trail. And typically it's a, confession of kind of intellectual disinterest in engaging the arguments. And so it is true that in our generation, which is a much more secular culture and a secular intellectual culture, it's the people on the left who are more likely to be engaging in that argument. Now, partly that's because, many human beings don't want to do the hard intellectual work of having to listen to the other side's arguments and respond and so on. That's difficult. But partly also that parts of the left have been captured by postmodernism, and postmodernism tells them, as a matter of principle, argument, logic, counter-argument, neutral free speech and civility, that whole package of beliefs is crap. We don't believe in any of that. Everything just is a power struggle for dominance. Anything that you can do to shut down positions that you disagree with, including all of the logical fallacies, including ad hominem, if it works rhetorically, go for it and do so.
So let me give you
one more thing. I do want to say,
I'm sorry.
As it is possible to be a strongly religious person and believe that it should be about reason and argumentation, it is possible to be a person on the left and believe that there are universal principles that are true about equity and fairness and so forth, and to have no truck at all with postmodernism crap. And so you're willing then to say, I think my left liberalism, or wherever I am, or even my socialism, is true, that we have the evidence and the argument on our side, and we're not going to do any of those tactics. We're going to make the arguments and engage the debates with people who disagree with us.
Okay, so I want to give you the counter argument, because you are not a postmodernist. And the counter argument is in Jonathan Haidt. Yes, he is a liberal, and he has a YouTube lecture. Race gender denying liberals should not go into social sciences, because if you go into social sciences and if you learn seriously intelligence, evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology, you come to the inevitable conclusion that there are some inherent differences between races, between men and women, etc. And at the end of his lecture, at the conclusion, he says all groups value the truth, both left and right. All groups hold things sacred. The sacred thing. But when the truth and the sacredness conflict, which they inevitably do, all groups throw truth under the bus and stick with their scared values. So,
if you don't mind, leave that slide up while I respond to that. Let me say I have great respect for Jonathan Haidt, right? If you don't mind, could you leave that slide up?
Okay. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
just a second. Oh, yes.
I give him great credit for being willing to engage across political divides and so forth, and for his founding role with the Heterodox Academy, which I joined some years ago at its foundation. But I do think that all of these propositions on this slide are false. There is something to evolutionary biology, obviously, and to evolutionary psychology, but it is vastly oversold by certain parts of the intellectual spectrum. It's a matter, in my judgment, of just telling a lot of just so stories after the fact. Now, a few things that I would point on here is, one thing is he's not talking about individuals, he's talking about groups. And that is not the level at which things operate. I mean, we do join groups, but even in a group, we are individuals and we can retain our individuality. So at most, what we have is a social psychological claim here, or some sort of sociological claim that's going on here. I do not think it's true that all individuals value the truth. There are lots of people, right, who do not value the truth. They are subjectivists. They know in their heart of hearts that they are believing in various things. They don't know if they're true. There are all kinds of conflicts, but they want to believe certain things to be true, and they're going to functionally act as if they are true, but they don't necessarily believe that they are true. You can see all of this going on in relationships. You know, I know people who work with women who are in abusive relationships, and the women will say, I know this guy beats me. I know he is a bad guy. But they go through all sorts of psychological mechanisms to suppress that and talk themselves into going back to the guy again. So the psychology is a whole lot more complicated. Not all individuals believe in the truth, right?
Okay.
We will go out of our way to avoid uncomfortable truths as individuals. So all groups hold things sacred. I would like to believe that's true, but I don't think all individuals hold things sacred. There are lots of people who give up on believing that life is particularly meaningful or sacred, right, or important. Love is just a myth. There is no decency, right? People are cynics about themselves. I know that I'm no better than anybody else. I know I should get up off the sofa and start that business, right, or call that girl and ask her for a date. But you know, is love sacred to that person? Is having a successful career sacred to that person? No, that person has kind of given up on life and is going to be, you know, what we call a couch potato, right?
But maybe the concept that nothing is sacred is sacred.
Yeah.
Maybe the concept that everything, you know, because the relatives says that.
No, I think at that point you're just playing with words, right? Sorry to push back, right? Sacred means something you put up on a pedestal. There's a strong difference between the good and the bad, the high and the low. And there are people who want to say, no, everything is low, everything is crap. And that is their operative belief. There is no sacredness. Now, they might believe that strongly, but believing that strongly is not the same thing.
It's not sacred. I meant something that you are willing to fight for.
Yeah, and then I was thinking, those people, they're not even going to willing to fight for it. You know, they're not going to get up and write a book about cynicism and pessimism and nihilism, right? Instead, they're just going to retire from life and let things sail away. So I don't think that second one is true. The third one I think also is true. When truth and sacredness conflict, which they inevitably do, I don't think they are inevitably going to conflict with each other. Often they will. I think if you get things right, your philosophical framework right, including your moral framework and your highest values, there doesn't have to be a conflict there. And it's also not true that all individuals or groups will throw truth under the bus. There's lots and lots of people who say, these are my political values. These are my moral values. These are my relationship values. I am totally in love with this woman or this person, or my religious values. I can't remember if I already said that one or not. But I see that these cannot possibly be true. And people change their minds on religion. I was gung-ho, speaking hypothetically, about this particular religion when I was 18 years old. I went and I studied philosophy and religion, and I started to have doubts. I questioned my faith. I had this enormous crisis and conflict going on in myself between what my mind was telling me is true and what I desperately thought was sacred and beautiful and noble about the world. What happens in that case is, of course, lots of people will abandon the truth for maintaining their belief in sacredness, but lots of people do also go the other way. They change their minds about what they take to be sacred because they think that they have to go with the truth.
Adapt their beliefs.
Political issues, they can be desperately in love with someone and change their minds about that, right, and so forth. So there are people who are committed to the truth, and they will prevail with the truth even if it conflicts with sacredness. So lots of interesting issues here, but I think I disagree with all of those formal propositions.
Okay, so we don't have a lot of time, and this is so much fascinating. In your Hebrew version, or the Hebrew translation of Explaining Postmodernism, as I said before, the name is not Explain, but Unveil Postmodernism, and I think it captures the essence of the book even better, because you are an anti-postmodern in any aspect. And the book cover, you see John Lennon, and underneath the mask, there is Joseph Stalin. So this is a book cover of the Hebrew version. Now, my question is, what can we extract from modernism? Because what can we extract for postmodernism? Modernism was good, was like the pinnacle of Western society. But what can we extract, any good values or attribute from postmodernism? Should we speak about feminism generation, the fourth wave of feminism, which is the post-third worst wave of feminism? Or should we go back to the modern era?
Okay. Yeah, very interesting question, right? What I would say is it's not a matter of going back to the modern era. We still are in the modern era. We still are in the Enlightenment, in the Enlightenment culture. I mean, the fact sides of the world having a...
Yes.
Okay. Yes, so we are still in a flourishing Enlightenment culture, right? By which we mean we prize individuals, the pursuit of happiness, right? The freedom of people to choose their own careers, the idea that women should have equal freedoms right, with men, that we are appalled by slavery, and we think that slavery is a moral abomination, and we've largely succeeded in eliminating slavery from most of the world and driven it underground. Right? We believe that science is making the world a better place, and all of the technology and so forth. And that very modern idea that we can make progress on pretty much all of these problems. That, I think, are still the dominant beliefs and the dominant institutions of not just Western civilizations, but increasingly global culture. What we do have, though, is, I think, a minority intellectual tradition that is very cynical and jaded, and I think is captured by postmodern right labels, and it is attacking all of those beliefs. And it is culturally ensconced in some very important aspects of culture. But I don't want to say that we live in a postmodern culture. I say what we have is a debate now, intellectually and culturally, between modernism and the Enlightenment and some postmoderns. And I don't also want to count out the pre-moderns. There are lots of pre-moderns, right, who have a more traditional, conservative, religious worldview, who are out there and retooling themselves. So it's not just a two-way debate, it's a three-way debate as well. So the question then would be, is there anything good to salvage from postmodernism? I would say at a philosophical level, no. Right? If you define your terms carefully, I think postmodernism is false and destructive all the way down. I think in many cases, the way postmodernism works is by capturing some things that modernism has built into it, right? So the idea that we need to
tolerance to different kinds of opinions.
Yeah, so certain kinds of tolerance, and there's a way that modernists for centuries have been trying to capture tolerance as a social value, but having differences about it. But what the postmoderns do is they kind of capture that important moral principle and then corrupt it or pervert it in a certain direction, right? Or the idea that we should be initially skeptical about big claims that are put to us and not just easily accept on faith or accept on authority, That's an important modernist principle. But if you take skepticism and anti-faith and you kind of buy into the most extreme versions of it, then you will get postmodernism coming out of it. So I would happily say that the Enlightenment project has been a resounding success intellectually and culturally, but it was not perfect. And in many cases, many of the big issues that we are engaged with in epistemology and the understanding of human nature, moral values, even metaphysics, the Enlightenment did not get those perfectly. They are very hard problems, and particularly the epistemological issues and the cognitive issues. Those are extraordinarily difficult. And as you know, we're still in the infancy with respect to human psychology and neuroscience, right, and so forth. So we have a lot of work ahead to do, as I always say, not to go back to the Enlightenment project, but rather to extend the Enlightenment project. What I see the postmoderns as doing is saying the modern project was tried. We think it's been a failure. We think it's crap. We don't like the cultural institutions, so we're just going to try to burn the whole house down.
And this is a resentment, Nietzsche's resentment that you speak about, yes?
Well, I think that's one of the major strands. So the Hebrew, I do like unveiling, right, postmodernism. I think postmodernism in general, there's a consistent set of philosophical principles, but there are a number of subversions that are distinctive. The same way you might say, there's Western religion, but there's Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The same thing I think is true of postmodernism. There's generic postmodernism, but there are more politicized versions of postmodernism. There are more cultural versions. There are more cognitive versions as well. And some of them are, especially the more political, are motivated by, as I think the cover captures very well, a reworking of a certain kind of authoritarian left-wing politics that can't stand its ground on modernist principles anymore. It's not the only one, but I do think that's an important one. And certainly in terms of cultural activism right now in our generation, that is the most dangerous one we need to understand.
So as a philosophy, we can gain nothing from postmodernism because if A equals B and B equals C, so A equals C, period. But as a culture, we can gain like sensitivity and maybe being more patient to different kinds of view. But again, as a philosophy, and you're a professor of philosophy, every true aspect of postmodernism can be found in the Enlightenment, in modernism philosophy, yes? In modern philosophy.
I think that's, absolutely true.
Okay, now...
At the same time, I do want to say that postmodernism is a long-standing tradition within philosophy and then, right, more broadly within Western culture, right? Every generation has people who are skeptical, who are subjectivist, who are cynical, who are just interested in power. And I think it's important that every generation we grapple with those issues. And I think as a modernist Enlightenment educator, I don't want to say, let's just not pay attention to postmodernism. We have to take its arguments seriously in order to strengthen, right, our own position. So postmodernism should have a seat at the table, but at the same time, it's important that we not only understand it, but we have to develop better arguments and defeat it.
And this is why we have the book, both in English and Hebrew. Huh? You see, it's a... Now, let's say that you convinced me totally. And this show is targeted to very intelligent people in Israel. What should or what can we do in order to increase free speech, in order to reduce the PC movement in our lives? What can we do?
Well, I think the important things partly are cognitive, right? Be aware of the issues. And sometimes those issues are philosophical, sometimes they're political, sometimes they're social, psychological, and so on. So we all have our areas of expertise and we want to be first rate, but we are part of a broader community and all of these things are going on. So we need to have that broader education as well. So being a first-rate scientist should be compatible with and nested within being a citizen, being a humanist, being a philosophically minded person in general. So be aware of the issues. Then I would say, be a person of some courage and be willing to stand up for your viewpoints. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be an expert on these issues, but if you are a person and you think that something is inappropriate, that is a dangerous stifling of argumentation, point that out, saying, look, we need to not do ad hominems here. We need not to politicize this. We need to look at the issues, and I might disagree with this position, but I'm going to let this position be articulated. And put your own voice out there and be a reasonable person. I think we will all have influence in our social circles, wherever we're coming from, in part based on our moral character. Obviously, we're all smart people and we know our areas, but people also pay attention to who seems genuinely interested in the truth, who is willing to listen to an argument, who can respond intelligently to an argument, who can identify what's actually at stake so that things aren't just going on at a subterranean level. So be a role model for truth-seeking, good character, social civility, and then you will have more influence in your field. And I think that's the way that we have to do it, all of us.
And don't confuse free speech for being rude. You can't have free speech, but you must be polite. Being able to do or to say whatever you want to say is not
Yes.
however you want to say it. You need to address it. Like you said at the beginning of our conversation, you might say things that might insult or hurt or makes some people angry. And you must be willing to accept this challenge because you are standing for your truth or your opinions. Yes?
Absolutely right. And especially in universities and colleges or any sort of research institutions, that has to be the operative principle. I mean, if I'm going to be a philosopher and I'm going to publish something, I have to know that there are going to be lots of smart people who will tell me that I am an idiot. Now that's rude. It's going to go with the territory. And they're going to attack my arguments, say in some cases things that maybe I haven't thought about. And I have to go into it being willing to say, criticize, hurt my feelings, and to say those things, and I shouldn't be an intellectual or a philosopher in the first place.
Wow. Now, I have this is a funny question, but I must ask you, which group do you consider to be the top of the discrimination hierarchy? Will this a single black mother lesbian woman or a Palestinian? And who decides who is on the top of the discrimination hierarchy?
Yeah. I don't think that's a legitimate question. I don't right question. I think that's totally an inappropriate way to frame things. Obviously, there are victims in the world. There are people who suffer victims status from all sorts of degrees, to outright extermination attempts, right, all the way down to just sideways glances because I don't like your religion or your race or treat you and so forth. So we should be aware of these things and we should push back against them. But I think the appropriate way to focus on all of these things is to say, look, you're an individual. You have your own mind. You have your own body. You can control your own mind and you can figure out the way the world works. And if you are in a free society or even a semi-free society, you've got lots of opportunities to make your life successful by your own lights. And there are plenty of other people out there who are smart and decent, willing to work with you. Emphasize the positive. At the same time, don't let the people who are idiots, who have psychological problems or who have bought into corrupt psychological and philosophical frameworks get too far inside your head. Don't let them dominate your thinking. If they have problems with racism or they don't like the fact of your religion, that is fundamentally their problem. Stand your ground, think your own mind, and rely on your own efforts to make your way in the world. You can do it. Victimology and playing the victim ranks is a way to sabotage yourself psychologically, to demoralize yourself, and just to set yourself up for failure.
Which leads, I think, to the heritage of the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, that the individual is the most important thing, and we don't need and we shouldn't judge anyone by his identity politics, right? If look at the individual before you and say, is he or she smart or talented enough for this specific job? And don't try to encapsulate anyone by his gender or race or et cetera, et cetera.
Right, so the way Martin Luther King Jr. put it, right? It's the content of your character. Now he's emphasizing your moral character, and that's exactly the right point. But of course, also it's the content of your intelligence in some social circles. It's the content of your productivity in business circles. So you judge individuals by their beliefs, by their intelligence, by their character, by their ability to get the job done. There's a wonderful line from Zora Neale Hurston, an early 20th century writer, who was well aware that there are lots of racists, right, and people who are going to judge her, partly because she was a woman, but partly on the basis of her skin color. And she just had a delightful response to that. She says, I just can't understand why anybody wouldn't want to be and to respect me. So basically what she's saying is she's got self-esteem. She knows that she's a wonderful person. Great ideas, lots of talent and imagination, good sense of humor, and so forth. That's the thing that you should be striving for, knowing for yourself that you are special, you are weak, you are talented, you can make a go of it. If you've got that, your life large, almost guaranteed be a success. You will have the right kind of people. Again, don't let the idiots wear you down.
Professor Hicks, I prepared so many questions regarding PC and regarding the epistemology of Nietzsche and postmodernism, but this was, wow, too much. I need to digest this conversation. First, thank you so much for your time and for your patience, and thank you so much for writing this book, because I think this book is truly a weapon against postmodernism phenomena that we see now in colleges, in campuses, and even in streets. So many, many, many thanks for your very important work that you did. And I must tell you that in Israel, this work has influenced many, many, many people. So again,
that's a pleasure to know. So let me thank you for inviting me on your show. A great conversation. Let me say, in a year or so, sometime in 2021, maybe we can have another conversation. As you say, there's lots of other issues. Let me also say that when we were planning to publish the translation, I did almost nothing, right, with respect to it, but there were some plans to bring me to Israel to give some lectures, and I know there are some intellectuals with whom I've had email correspondence in Israel I would very much like to meet. So let's stay in touch, and perhaps also we can meet in person next year.
This will be my privilege. And please, for your next version of your book, Unveiling Postmodernism, I think it's even better than explaining postmodernism.
I will give some thought and talk with my publishing people.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Stephen Hicks. Bye-bye.